It was definitely really challenging to cope with because when you just have people around you all the time telling you that you're the problem, like I didn't even notice the mood swings that come with hypoglycemia because I was just depressed in general because everything was like when you're getting told that you're the problem, you feel emotionally sad anyway. So like everything that comes along with hypoglycemia, I wouldn't have been able to pick up on because it was just all the time.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see you two.
Hello.
Hello.
All right, on the show today, hypoglycemia. What is it? Why is it important to know about it? Hypoglycemia happens when our blood sugar levels in our body are too low, and we've all seen those candy bar commercials that show people getting hangry. They're hungry and angry at the same time. I'm guessing, I'm not a doctor, but I'm guessing they're getting cranky from low blood sugar, Dr. Cooper. What is hypoglycemia exactly, and why is it important?
Well, we spend a lot of time thinking about hyperglycemia, which is like pre-diabetes and diabetes when the blood sugar is too high. But we don't talk a lot about hypoglycemia, which is when the blood sugar is too low. So if you think about it, the normal fasting blood sugar range is thought to be 65 to 99, but hypoglycemia is defined as a blood sugar below 70. So even in the fasting state, if you're down in the 60s, it's time to eat. You're probably starting to run a little bit low. But in general, hypoglycemia is defined as glucose levels, which is your blood sugar, below 70. And then below 53 is thought to be more severe. And in fact, if you're below 30, you could start having severe medical complications like seizures, coma. It could be fatal.
And that's because your body just isn't getting fuel where it needs to go. Is that right?
Yeah. Glucose is our primary fuel source, and especially the primary fuel source of the brain. So for us to be able to think clearly and make decisions, our mood, stability, it's all dependent on glucose levels.
Generally speaking, Dr. Cooper, if we start to feel kind of that shaky feeling, is that generally like a sign maybe that our blood sugar is a little too low?
It really is. And some people don't have as many symptoms. And sometimes we find that people that have had long-standing hypoglycemia, sometimes their symptoms just are overlooked. They don't realize because they're so used to it. But the typical symptoms, if you start falling below 70, in that 53 to 70 range, you might feel just kind of slowed down mentally, tired, craving sugar, heart rate starts to go a little bit faster. And then as it gets lower and lower, you can feel shaky, sweaty, dizzy. You can really begin to forget your words and feel really emotional.
Does this have any connection to diabetes? Is this one of those things where it's like, oh, you just need to eat a piece of candy or eat some sugar? Can a Snickers solve your problem?
That's what I want to know too.
I know. Basically this whole show is about, can candy solve your problem?
Well, in a pinch, it can get you by for a little while, but sometimes. But, it's interesting because it's counterintuitive, but it is because, again, diabetes, prediabetes is about high blood sugar. We're talking about low blood sugar, hypoglycemia, but it is related. They are related in a way because hypoglycemia shares some common underlying pathophysiology with diabetes and even obesity. So it has to do with a weakness along the metabolic pathway that can occur. And
It's so weird. The high and the
yeah,
low are both related in the same way.
yeah, I mean, they are not the same, but similar weaknesses that can occur in our metabolic feedback loop can lead to low blood sugar reactions. And sometimes that can actually be a precursor to developing prediabetes later on.
Weird.
I guess I should have told you this earlier, Dr. Cooper. You've been my doctor for about 10 years. When I was a little kid, I was tested for low blood sugar because I was sort of having those symptoms and it ran in my family. And I'm sorry that I didn't mention this 10 years ago.
Oops.
But is there a genetic component to this? And is it related to metabolic syndrome?
You know, it runs in families. It's because if you think about it, obesity, prediabetes, diabetes, has a huge genetic component. And so why wouldn't dysregulation of blood sugar going the other direction also, have that same genetic component? So with our patients, we often see family members that are affected. And so it's super common to have these kind of histories. And the interesting thing is the hypoglycemia often does start in childhood. Usually it does. And so I didn't know that about you, Mark, but knowing that now, it makes sense. And we probably would have said, hey, did you notice any of this in childhood? Because it usually starts in childhood. And as it progresses through life, the body goes through a series of defense mechanisms that are meant to prevent the hypoglycemia. And that's what kind of propels a person closer to prediabetes and eventually diabetes if it's untreated.
Okay, let's bring in a patient of Dr. Cooper. Let's bring in Meera right now because Meera has dealt with hypoglycemia. Meera, it's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So, Meera, I'd love for you just to kind of take us back and tell us your story up to the point where you met Dr. Cooper.
Well, technically, it starts when I was born. If you look at my history according to Dr. Cooper, she quoted my birth situation to my mother before we even told her, which my mom was baffled by. I thought was hilarious. But I was really skinny as a kid, which of course my pediatrician just kept telling us, okay, just feed her more carbs. But then I hit puberty and my metabolism ground to a halt. And I immediately started packing on weight very quickly. I was a very, very sporty kid. I did tons of sports, track and field, gymnastics, ski racing, swimming, horseback riding. I did tons of sports, which is probably what maybe kept things a little under control. I don't think so. I think it made it worse, but it brought a lot of attention to my weight. The fact that it came on quite fast, and a lot of people around me made it a pretty big deal, which wasn't super great. And eventually, when I hit the end of middle school and high school, led to an eating disorder. And by the end of high school, I got put into treatment for that eating disorder, which I was very happy about. And it was a doctor there who was working with Dr. Cooper who saw those patterns in my labs and said, I think that you should go see this doctor. Her name's Dr. Cooper. Here's her book. And between her recommendation and my mom's persistence with Dr. Cooper's office, I got in and I got to see her, which was absolutely wonderful. So yeah, it's always been a problem, but I never really felt it physically, the hypoglycemia. It just has been how it's always been until I started getting treated. And now I feel symptoms if I let it go. Like if I miss food, then I can feel it. But when I was little, it's just like how I always was, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, Meera, you were an active kid, all kinds of sports, and then suddenly you start packing on weight. And was that confusing to you at that point?
Yeah, it definitely was, because what everyone tells you is you just need to eat healthy and work out. And we did in my house. It was all organic food all the time. We never did any kind of fast food, and we ate pretty regularly, the 3 meals a day, all that kind of stuff. And nothing changed except for me hitting puberty. And so it didn't really make any sense. But everyone around me was kind of accusing me of like being lazy or eating too much and all this stuff. So I just kept on trying to work out more. And eventually I just started trying to eat less. And, Andrea has mentioned on the podcast before, I'm a very big fan, that, every diet worked until it didn't. I did not have that experience. Every diet that I tried did not work at all. The only time I saw any weight decrease at all was when I went to super extremes. And those didn't even work for very long. It would like work for a month or two. And then I had pretty severe rubber band effects and would shoot back past the weight that I had been at in the first place.
Andrea, what's your reaction to Meera's story?
I feel terrible for what you had to go through. I'm like, but it's interesting that you say that the symptoms that you had as a kid, you didn't even notice because that was your regular, that was your life. So, of course, you didn't notice them because that was your baseline,
Mhm.
Right.
So why would you think that was weird? That was your life. You wouldn't think that was a different thing or that was something that you would notice because that was your norm.
Yeah. It was definitely really challenging to cope with because when you just have people around you all the time telling you that you're the problem, like I didn't even notice the mood swings that come with hypoglycemia because I was just depressed in general because everything was like when you're getting told that you're the problem, you feel emotionally sad anyway. So, like everything that comes along with hypoglycemia, I wouldn't have been able to pick up on because it was just all the time. So it was interesting when I started getting treatment finally because now I feel it immediately. If it happens, I always joke with my best friend that's like, my body's immediately punishing me if it's not getting food.
Meera, what was that like getting hospitalized for an eating disorder? And it must have been a struggle, a journey, ups and downs. Is there a way to describe that period of your life?
Yeah, definitely. I was put into what they called intensive outpatient treatment. So I didn't end up fully in the hospital, but the year leading up to me finally getting diagnosed and treated was I don't remember most of high school, but I don't remember my senior year of high school at all. It was just one big giant fog because it was when like I'd just kind of given up on trying all the diets. So I just was eating as little as possible and trying to work out, but I had no energy left anymore to work out. So it had just gotten really bad. And so by the time my parents finally were like, "We think you should talk to your primary care doctor," who is lovely. I'm very privileged to have a wonderful primary care doctor, although she retired, which is so tragic
Oh.
for me. When she said, "Okay, I think you should talk to these people at this treatment center," I was like, "All right, whatever." I couldn't really care about it. So for me, the day that we went into the treatment center to be evaluated, and I had a doctor sit me down and look me in the face and say, "This isn't your fault. You have an eating disorder." I think the normal reaction is to panic. I was so relieved. It was like this utter wave of relief washed over me because I was like, okay, this is the first grown up that's ever told me that this isn't my fault. This is wonderful. And she immediately laid out these rules for me like, you cannot keep using your calorie counting app. You have to delete it off of your phone and your iPad, and you have to start eating. And I was like, oh, that's great. I panicked a little bit on my first day of treatment when they said that I had to start eating carbs because I was like, but I'm not supposed to do that. So I had a little mini freak out on the first day. But I took to treatment a lot better than is you typically see with my eating disorder cohorts because I really did want to get to eat and not feel like a bad person. So, yeah, I that summer that I was in treatment was actually quite positive for me because my parents responded really really well to me getting put on the like meal plan and stuff. And for the first time, all the people around me weren't allowed to commentate on what I was eating anymore. So, I did quite well with it. I was also in this kind of safety bubble for the first time with food where, like, no one was allowed to be mean to me and I could just eat the food and that was allowed. It got harder when I went to university because I was out of that safety bubble. But yeah, well, there were some challenges with, having to deal with some of the therapy side of things. I took to treatment a lot better than is common amongst my eating disorder friends.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry.
that's you explained all that really, really
Hmm.
well. Dr. Cooper, is that common for people with eating disorders to sort of be in a mental fog like Meera was?
Oh, yeah. It really is. It's the eating disorders. What I always wonder is, okay, what comes first with eating disorders? Because not all eating disorders come from the same thing at all. And in Mira's case, like a lot of patients, I feel like the eating disorder was secondary to a metabolic disorder. So, because it started with she had extreme kind of weight differences as a child, she did have a period of mild, what's called failure to thrive, like where you're having trouble putting on weight. And then as she got older, being very athletic and having trouble keeping her weight on. And then hitting puberty, when you have the genetic predisposition for metabolic dysfunction, usually at times of the growth spurt for both girls and boys is when it starts triggering. And so often they'll put weight on, but not actually do the vertical growth. So things start getting out of balance. And then to manage that, she was just innocently starting to look at what she's eating and start like manipulating that. And then that wasn't working. And so it went further and further and further. And so not every person is going to slide down into an eating disorder in that situation, but they've seen that certain people with certain brain types, it's easier to kind of fall prey to that where it gets to a real extreme. So I think in her case, it was really the eating disorder secondary to the original metabolic dysfunction. And so most people in an eating disorder where they're like nutritionally so depleted, they definitely are in a fog. I mean, it's not the same person anymore. It's like their spirit has kind of left their body in a way. There's not the vital life force in a person who's in an active eating disorder. And it's really strange because you do see the same pattern in everyone when they're in that state of malnourishment. It's a similar repetitive pattern that you see. And so coming out of that with what's called refeeding, when you're in this intensive outpatient program, the food is controlled and your body is renourished with the help of a medical team. And the fog gradually lifts coming out of that. But then you're back to the original metabolic dysfunction that was there before the eating disorder came. And because of the period of deficits brought on by the eating disorder, probably amplifies the underlying problem.
So when Meera came to you through the other doctor, did you see the metabolic problem and the metabolic syndrome, or which thing do you treat first?
That's a great question. Well, fortunately, Meera's doctors were great. They have an amazing program. And I had been in contact with them. They had contacted me before Meera became a patient, just going over her case. And so we were sort of collaborating a little bit with some ideas. So I think they also were recognizing that there was a metabolic issue during her recovery process. And so that's kind of what brought her my way. And so the metabolic issue really did jump out right away. You could see it. And it had to do with a dysregulation of the glucose levels after eating. So when a person goes to eat, your blood sugar is supposed to increase after you eat. So, of course, most people would think of that's logical. You ate something, so your blood sugar level, your glucose should be higher after you eat than it was before you ate. But in patients who have hypoglycemia, it's often the opposite. And so that's what was really happening for Meera. And there was a problem with the insulin spiking up after eating. And that's similar to what you've described, Mark, with your condition too.
Yeah.
And
that happened to me.
so it's a similar thing. And so what happens over time, though, is with being in a food deficit for a really long time, the hypoglycemia kind of digs in and it's very persistent. And that's even occurring in spite of the insulin not even spiking anymore. So there's a lot of complicated layers of hypoglycemia. I call it like hypoglycemia syndrome because it's kind of a continuum of problems and it can get worse and worse and worse and get into a situation where it's very hard to get out of it. But fortunately, because Meera had been through the nutrition rehabilitation, it was in a state where it wasn't like the worst. You could start doing some effective treatments.
Yeah. Her body wasn't like freaking out like it was before because it wasn't
Yes,
getting the calories.
exactly.
Right? Meera, you look so happy and healthy today. It's just so cool to see that. How do you manage the hypoglycemia today? I think people listening are probably wondering how it got under control.
Well, I wouldn't call it 100% under control yet. We are still actively working on that, me and Dr. Cooper, because it's been quite a challenge to undo all of the damage. I think that my eating disorder made it worse. There's no way to check that because, it's not like I was getting labs drawn when I was a kid. But the basic kind of treatment that we're working on is I'm on, all the meds that I'm on that I have to take regularly, and then I have to eat constantly. I am supposed to eat every like 2 to 2.5 hours or so, which is actually quite hard for me to manage because that's a lot. That's a lot of food and it's all the time. Plus, I have this fun little wrinkle where I also have celiac disease, which means I am allergic to gluten, which just makes getting
boy.
food all the more
Jeez.
difficult. But yeah, so that's the biggest part of it really is managing the food because I have to continuously make sure that my glucose levels are being perked up because whenever it drops, it just digs its heels in harder. And we had a pretty big setback in 2022 and getting it recovered from there has been really hard. And yeah, but it's a combination of meds and food and I need to make sure I'm getting enough sleep, I'm sleeping at the right times, I have to drink enough water. Yeah, I have to really prioritize taking care of myself, and and I have mixed results with how effective I am at that. Some days are better than others.
Well, don't we all?
And your experiments, Meera, with your exercise were, I think that wasn't that part of in 2022? I don't recall, but
Yeah, so exercise has proven to not have all that positive of an impact on my system. It tends to really exacerbate the problem. And that was actually back in 2019, I think. I so badly wanted to do some exercise because I don't know, I get really excited about stuff. I have ADHD too, so I'll get like really obsessed with something and want to do it. And so one of our appointments, I looked at Dr. Cooper and I was like, "So is there any chance that I could do CrossFit?" And she was like, "Excuse me." But we came because I wanted to do it so badly. She was like, "If you can find someone who will give you modified CrossFit where you do absolutely no cardio, we can give this a shot." And I pulled it off. I found a coach who was willing to work with me. And so that's what I did. I did basically just lifting and stretching. And it still had a really negative impact on my labs. Like you could see my hypoglycemia getting worse, my insulin spiking getting worse, and then all of the other labs that we have, everything got worse. And so when the pandemic hit and we couldn't do exercising anymore, I backed off of that and there was immediate positive results. So that's always been an interesting thing to witness, that I always make jokes to my friends that I'm allergic to exercise.
Dr. Cooper, that's fairly common, isn't it, when you treat people with metabolic dysfunction or syndrome that you tell us don't exercise for a while? That was when we first met. I was like, seriously? Isn't that the opposite of what I should be doing? Because I've got this huge gut?
Well, I mean, exercise is such an important component of our health. I mean, we want to be active. Definitely, it's good for our heart. It's good for so many things, that have to do with our health. But when you have metabolic dysfunction, especially the hypoglycemia, the exercise demands start to pull more glucose into the muscles out of the bloodstream. And so, if you're not careful, you can end up with accentuating that hypoglycemia. So, we like to get the exercise in at some point because we need to test to see if a person can handle it. That's a sign of good health and improvement in the blood sugar regulation. But we have to start with first getting the glucose at a baseline into the normal range, getting rid of all those hypoglycemia episodes, having a stronger metabolism, having really strong baseline nutrition. The nutrition really is the foundation of the treatment of hypoglycemia. Without that, it's impossible to recover from hypoglycemia. So you really have to have a balanced diet with all the food groups and try to, eat frequently, as Meera was saying, to not have to chase that blood sugar when it drops all the time to try to maintain a good glucose level. And then once that seems to be in a good place, then you can start to put some exercise in. But what you want to do is make sure the exercise is not timed at the same time when your body physiologically experiences the lows. So you have to kind of understand your pattern, your glucose patterns. And some of our patients, we do have them wait a certain amount of time after eating to start exercising to avoid the little slump that can occur after eating and wait till it recovers. But eventually we can put some exercise in very slowly. But again, we have to increase the fuel intake, the nutrition to match it. And we don't start with cardio because it has a more pronounced impact on the hypoglycemia. So instead, we do start with strength exercise that has some rest periods between sets and things like that. And if we are doing okay with that, then start to incorporate not high intensity, but lower intensity exercise. And the higher the intensity, the more carbohydrates it requires. And carbohydrates are basically blood glucose and stored glucose in the muscles. And so if you have a deficit of that, it's really not a good place to start with high intensity exercise. So there is hope of getting the exercise back in, but you've got to wait till it's the right time.
Yeah, first things first.
Yeah.
Andrea, as I was listening to Meera's story, when she got to the point where she said it was such a relief to know that it was a medical problem.
Oh my God.
If someone hasn't gone through that process like you have, I mean, you endured decades of people looking at you sideways and judging you, and even doctors judging you.
All doctors.
Yes,
I don't think I had a doctor who didn't look at me sideways or didn't blame, oh, the reason you have this problem with the measles at 25 is, well, it's probably because your weight is bad. I mean, I'm not kidding. It's like every single thing that ever is wrong is because, well, you're probably, it's because you're overweight. It's because you're not taking care of yourself. It's because something's wrong with the way you live. You're not exercising, even though at a lot of the points, I was exercising all the time. I was like the aerobics girl,
you went to Slenderella for Pete's sake.
Well, of course, the Slenderella. And also I was like a Jane Fonda workout person. I mean, I had a lot of leggings. I had a lot of, I love those outfits. But, it was, and plus, that when you're bigger than everybody else, there's a problem. And everybody does say things, do things. Oh, you would be this if only you were thin. You could be more successful if you were thin. I mean, and it's kind of true when everybody else, like other people are rising the corporate ladder and you're like, wait a minute. I mean, it's true. I mean, there's no question. But then when you hear, oh my God, it's a medical problem. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't because I ate the wrong things. It wasn't because I wasn't eating the wrong things. I wasn't eating more than other people. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. Changes your whole attitude. I can't stress it enough, and that it's taken me, even the 10 years to sort of find my own and be like, screw you, everybody. I am me. I am doing whatever I want to do. I'm wearing what I want to wear. I'm doing whatever I want to do. I just go where I want to go. And this is me. This is who I am. And this is how it's going to be.
Yeah.
And it really does change it creeps into every little thing about you. It's a very strange thing, because the flip side of it had crept into every other thing too and been a negative. So now that negative is gone, and you can be like physically and mentally lighter. It's the most bizarre thing that I never anticipated.
Yeah. And that's, by the way, what we love about you, Andrea, is that you are you and you are fantastic.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I was always a very positive kind of person, but now I see where the negative and the downer kind of stuff came from. And now it's like, oh, all the lightness can just be there.
Meera, you've been on this crazy journey that's really been, I'm guessing, an emotional roller coaster. How does life feel to you today?
Life is very different from how it used to be. We're still working on it. I'm not done with my journey with Dr. Cooper. I don't think we ever will be. But we're still in the midst of it in a lot of ways, which has its challenges. One of the hardest parts of all this has been the way that hypoglycemia has interfered with some of the goals that I've had in life, which is always challenging. I've had to rearrange certain things and let go of others, which has been a challenge. But I've managed to shift my perspective on so many things. Like, I used to think I was broken because, why couldn't I get a handle on this thing that everyone seemed to think was so easy? Or that, I was somehow fundamentally flawed because of this issue. And I don't feel that way anymore. It feels like a potentially solvable thing. And I've still got certain emotional aspects of this that I have to work on, but
Sure.
that's for my therapist. Um and so I've started to, find ways to implement those dreams that I have into my treatment, and instead of letting the more challenging aspects of treatment put my life on hold, I'm finding ways to make sure that I can make treatment work with my life instead, which has lifted some of the aspects where I used to kind of pout and be like, well, I can't do all these things for these reasons. So life is really different, and that's nice. And I will say that having Dr. Cooper as part of my medical team changed everything in a really positive way, and I'm very grateful for her. So, yeah.
Oh, that's so
Aw.
nice. Because it's like, you're not flawed. Your body is flawed. It's like saying the road is flawed, not you. So
Mhm.
it's like, if the road is flawed, you just take the car on a different road.
Different to have a doctor for me who looks at my weight as just a data point. Like, in the way that I am treated by her, she doesn't you've never treated my weight as the goal for me. It's about fixing my metabolism so that I can be happy and feel better,
Mhm.
which is really nice because my entire life everyone treated my weight as something like that's what had to be fixed. I had to be smaller in a certain size, and instead of that, it's just a data point that you don't make me look at, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
It's just a data point that gives us information so that we can fix this thing that makes me feel sick,
Mhm.
And that's a really different perspective that pretty much no one else in my entire life has ever operated off of. So,
Mm.
it's a very comforting thing to get to
Mhm.
experience.
I was saying to somebody the other day, because they were asking me some questions, and I was saying that the difference is that this was the first time a doctor said to me, well, why is this happening? Instead of just like, well, let's see how we can make you lose weight and here's a diet. It was
Mhm.
like, well, why is this happening? And I think what you're talking about is the exact same thing. It's like the weight isn't the goal. The goal is, why is this happening and how do we fix the reason that this is happening?
Mhm.
We'll deal with the weight, we'll deal with all that stuff. Yes, we'll deal with that. But the real problem is, why is this happening?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
nobody ever looked at why it was happening. I never knew that was even a thing you could look at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as we start to wrap things up, Dr. Cooper, what I learned from every single one of these episodes that we do together is that metabolic function is absolutely unique to every human being. And if you've met one person with metabolic dysfunction, you've met one person with a certain type of metabolic dysfunction.
Right.
And the judgment that comes along with so many people, so many of us who've struggled with weight, who've struggled with metabolic issues, the judgment that is just carelessly cast on those people like Andrea and like Meera is so misplaced because, as we've talked about, it's a medical condition. And I just hope that we can, as a society, get to a place where we just embrace everyone in their uniqueness. Dr. Cooper, any summarizing thoughts for today's episode? Meera, it's been so great to get to know you and to hear your story.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Yeah.
coming.
Thanks so
Yeah.
Thanks
much,
for having
Meera.
me.
Thanks so much. It's great to hear, your perspective on things. But I do think that people should really start to kind of be aware of how they feel. And if they're suspicious of hypoglycemia, to raise that with their primary care doc and maybe try to get some testing done. The testing would be before eating and after eating blood sugar levels. And it's not necessary to consume like the sweet sugary glucose drink. It's actually better to eat just a regular meal to check it out. But it's important because glucose is basically our life force. And if it's depleted, that is going to potentially cause cognitive impairment, even if it's just temporary, but it could lead to repetitive cognitive impairment, which can be a long-term problem. It can lead to mood dysregulation and, just reduction in energy and vitality. And so that's why with people like Meera's age group, I really am trying to focus on trying to get that glucose up, because that's the time of life when you're really looking at achieving things. Your goals that you have for yourself are very important. So that's just my feeling. And I think people can have severe hypoglycemia. Also, we hear about it a lot in diabetic patients who are like type 1 diabetes. And that's really important too. And patients like that with hypoglycemia have to carry around like emergency things to get their glucose up, but such as glucagon, which is a medication. But what we're talking about today are just people who are not really in that camp, where it's just an underdiagnosed condition in the population. And in some cases, a precursor of what eventually later can become prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. So paying attention to those symptoms, I think, is important, and trying to eat a balanced diet. And if it doesn't improve with that balanced diet, complex carbs, proteins, and fats, and frequent eating throughout the day, fueling your exercise, means you really should get a workup.
All right. This has been so rewarding. Thank you, Meera. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper, a Work P2P production. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.